Okay, let's explore how to create an Events2Metric feature. So the way to do it, hover over data flow, go down to Events2Metrics. This will bring the dashboard and the list of all the different Events2Metrics you have set up. Click on New Events2Metric. The first thing you'll see right at the top, the basic details. This is the name and the description. Note this name doesn't have an impact on the metric field names that you generate. So this name is just for the configuration, just to store the configuration. It doesn't impact the name of the fields, the actual name of the metric fields themselves. A description, obviously, so you can call it my E2M, for example, whatever you want. Now you have two options here, logs or spans. I'll go through a worked example with logs, but I just want to highlight the difference between logs and spans. With logs, you have a query, you have scope and subsystem, or application and subsystem severity. For spans, it's slightly different. There's no severity anymore because spans don't really have a severity. You have application subsystem. You also have service and action. Action is typically the endpoint that the span refers to, and service is the actual service that generated the span in the first place. Everything else is the same, okay? So you pull fields from the span in the same way. You attach labels from the fields attached to the span in the same way. You have permutations to consider in the exact same way. So let's go through a worked example with the logs now. To start with, you can just write a Lucene query here. For example, anything there. So for example, json.http, resp took ms. There you go. So you can just see that will now query for anything with this field present. Then you can look for applications to subsystems. You can add specific apps here. So I can take my AWS Lambda and I can lock onto the cart service subsystem as well. What this allows me to do is to make very, very specific queries. Now, it's always better to make specific queries. This just avoids any potential slowdown. Remember, if you're making these massive queries and trying to generate metrics from them, that's more that the platform has to search through. So a nice specific query will mean guaranteed 60-second granularity, really fast, really short time to generate that metric. It'll just remove any possibility of latency. So strongly, strongly recommend that you make a more specific query rather than a general query. Of course, you can select severity as well, so it's just better to fill all this in as much as possible. I'll set these back to all just for the sake of ease. Now for metric fields, you can declare up to 10 different metric fields. Now, how does a metric field work? I'll give you an example. If I make a metric field that's like this, I will now have a metric series called my E2M metric, and I can decide where that comes from. So for example, I'm checking for that HTTP response took time, so let's just took ms. So now what I'm saying is that I have a field metric name, my E2M metric, that now has the value of whatever is in this. It's really important when you're selecting the field from your log, it has to be a true numeric value. So it has to be numeric in the sense that it appears in the schema here as a number, but also it has to be a value that you want to do mathematics with. So for example, if you have an ID that's completely numeric, it doesn't really make sense to divide two IDs by one another. Rather, it's better to have a number like latency or error rate or anything like that, something that you wish to do mathematics with. So just think, am I picking the right value here? If it's numeric, if it's a true numeric value. If we open up advanced here, you'll see that we have a bunch of different options. So we have a bunch of default aggregations that happen: max, min, count, average, sum, and the samples that are generated as well. If I remove these, I can decide which metric fields are actually generated. You'll see here that we have my E2M metric, that's the name, and then it will be suffixed with CX max, CX min, CX count. These are all different metric series. It's really nice because rather than having to constantly write max queries or constantly average things or whatever, you just have the series doing it for you already. It's a really, really nice option. For histograms are great. You can just type in, for example, 95th and 99. This will get you the 95th percentile and the 99th percentile of the data as well. Super powerful for SRE use cases, tracking SLOs and SLIs. Remember, you can have up to 10 of these. If you define none of these, you're going to get a really basic a metric. And all it does, the only thing that it does, is it will have a count of the number of logs that match this query every 60 seconds. And it will be named after this, so like my E2M CX logs count or docs count. And this is useful to see how many logs are being hit by your Events2Metric, but just be aware of that. So it's almost always the case that you want to generate some metric fields. Now for your labels are essentially values that you wish to add to your metrics. Now for labels, you need to be aware of a few things. Labels are essentially like your indexes for your metrics. So for example, one could choose continent, add the continent name. And that's really useful if you think you're going to be grouping the metrics by continent, querying and filtering by continent, and so on. If you never wish to make that query or you never wish to do that slice, there's no point adding these labels. Be really aware of this because it has an implication as well to the number of permutations that you'll use as well. So you can see an example here where what I'm essentially saying is, okay, we'll slice by continent, I'll do this. What this actually means, really interesting, there's only one constant value, it seems, in the past 7 days. So you only have a permutation of 1. Now what that means is that there's only one different value here. Now the problem with these permutations is that they can go up and they can explode. So be really aware of this. We'll do a section towards the end of the video that will explain permutations in some more detail. But just be aware that it can explode, the number of labels that you've got, and that can be quite difficult. So have a look at this graph and have a look at how many metrics are being, how many permutations are being used per day, and then that will inform the value that you put in there. Now, once again, with your labels, just be really aware that the labels are essentially your indexes. They're how you can query and slice your data. So just be on top of that and think up front, okay, I wish to query by continent or country or IP address or host or cloud provider or whatever. And think about how you're going to use this data because it's going to inform how you define your labels. So just to recap what we've gone through, we've covered the basic details. We've covered the difference between logs and spans. Remember, you've got those extra 2 services and actions there. We've shown how to define queries, and once again, always better to have very specific query scope and severity in there. Same thing with spans, always better to have query and scope as really specific as possible. We've gone through metric fields and what happens if you don't define any metric fields versus what you get if you do define some metric fields, and of course the best fields from your logs to actually take, true numeric values. And then we've gone over the labels field as well and explained why labels are really useful and really powerful. So that's just a recap and a run through of how to actually create Events2Metrics in the Coralogix platform.